All right, so it's Todd Atkins here, and I'm here with Miguel Iterati from the MMA Museum Project, MMA Collector, MMA Museum Podcast. And today we're going to do kind of a step away from some of the things that we do. We're talking about current events. We're going to talk about Joe Silva, kind of his rise in the UFC and maybe a little bit of his disappearance. A lot of people don't, there's only limited information on that. But we're going to talk about Joe Silva today. And as always, before we start, I have a sponsor, Live to Fight Design. You can find them at Instagram, Live to Fight Design. And if you use my promo code, which is up there in red, you can get $20 off your order for Fight Banner or Gym Banner. And Miguel, so I kind of wanted to get into, you knew Joe Silva, kind of talk me through the early days of his rise with the UFC and his rise in MMA in general.
All right. Joe was from the East Coast. He lived near D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, in that area. I know where he lives, but I don't need people stalking him either. So but we used to exchange tapes. Is one of the ways we start to know each other. The communication method that a lot of people used in those really old days, I'm talking about the 90s, was America Online. And being on it, there was a message board on there, and he was Joe Silva. There were other people on there. Joe Gold from Full Contact Fighter was Band Dog 7. So there are people around still from those old MMA days. Joe was there. I believe Joe, in an interview before he stopped doing interviews, said he went to his first UFC for UFC 3. And my understanding of his story is that he walked in there kind of as a fan, but he had an awareness of like the Japanese scene and a few things of that nature. That he was also a good speaker. So I think he, at that point, sort of introduced himself to Meyerowitz and Art Davie and those people. And then, he showed up at UFC 4 again and UFC 5, and all of a sudden he's in their ear. At some point, and this is deservedly so, I think he was adding knowledge and depth to them, especially Bob Meyerowitz. Bob, at some point, started paying for his trip to the UFC instead of him, going by his own dime. And at some point may have gotten, $500 to him too, for every show. So he was getting a little consulting fee and stuff like that. That number's in my head, but it's so long ago, I may be off on that. Maybe somebody else $500. But at some point, Joe Silva's relationship with the UFC became less of a guy who shows up and more of a guy that's got some power and has the ear of the owner to give advice, a consultant. So he was a consultant in the early days. He was a young man at that point. When Art Davie left the UFC, John Peretti replaced him as the matchmaker. And from talking to Bob Meyerowitz and Art Davie at different occasions, Joe wasn't ready to assume that role at that point yet. And that's why they liked Peretti. Peretti was a big name. They needed a big name. Joe was sort of helping Art and doing a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. Joe would have liked the job probably by then. And Joe probably could have done it by then. But they chose to get Peretti in a full, guy with experience and that was known in the business as more than Joe. Joe didn't have the reputation yet as a UFC matchmaker. So he was young. So he didn't get, maybe the first time he went in for the UFC matchmaker job under Meyerowitz, he didn't get it. He wasn't really in the running. Peretti shows up, he stays around, and I think this is the first hint of some survivability there. Because him and Peretti managed to work together. Peretti didn't fire him. Nobody got rid of, he survived that era. And when Zuffa purchased the UFC, if you look at it, Art Davie's gone. John Peretti had a rival offer to buy the company, so he was out of the running and moving on. Meyerowitz wasn't really, I think, I don't know if he stayed on as a consultant or if he took phone calls from people or whatever, but, he didn't stay on in any type of visible capacity. The only person from the old to the new that was there is Joe. To a certain extent, John McCarthy, but McCarthy didn't last that long before he pissed Dana off at some point, with being too much of a ref, this, that, Dana and John, it's not like Joe. Joe, you see what Joe did. Joe was the transitional figure inside the matchmaking and all that stuff. McCarthy has to be out of that. So, Joe was definitely the most powerful figure that went from the original company, SEG, to Zuffa. Dana needed Joe at that moment. Joe was, at that point, the strongest he was ever going to be.
Yeah, now maybe talk a little bit about. I know you kind of talked about your relationship with him, trading tapes. Let's talk about that a little bit more because I think it's something that's interesting for people that maybe weren't around then. They can kind of understand that world that was so important back then that's probably not important at all now.
No. Now it's like, hey, you get a link or you see a link or, you check YouTube, you can see a portion of the fight or some distorted version. Everybody thinks they saw the fight or whatever. It's much more saturated. But
Or
back in
Fight
those,
Pass.
yeah, and there you're getting a good clean version. Back in the old days of the beginning of the sport, you'd catch the UFC. Let's say you saw UFC on pay-per-view from the first one. From the first one to the second one is like 5-6 months. And literally people wait 5-6 months. You probably didn't think much about fighting. Oh yeah, I remember that UFC, but that concept of a league or the next fight or anything like that, I don't think was fully planted yet, right? So hey, then UFC 2 pops up. And if you're someone like a Joe Silva, you're aware of the scene in Japan where Shudo's been operating for a while. Pancrase predated the UFC, and you're familiar with people that in world enough that you're able to get somebody in Japan to make a VHS copy and mail it to you. So Joe had a very valuable piece of knowledge there, that would help him as a foundation for his job, was that he actually saw a lot of the really early fighters, and he was right there at the roots of to see it start developing. And he had a very good idea of that stuff. Like I may not agree with everything he ever said, but he had always a good way of trying, to keep things in a sportive way, So his judgment was good, and I think that's one of the reasons he stayed on. But when he went from Zuffa, or he was now a Zuffa employee, there was little bumps in the road there, here and there, and him and Dana butted heads. But at some point, Dana, we now know, is kind of an overwhelming force. So but I think Joe was his foil in the company for a long time until Dana was able to do what Joe, until Dana could replace Joe and at least get somebody else in there to also do the job. What did they keep adding weight class until Joe clerically can't handle 8 weight classes, so they take the lightweights and under and give them to a new guy, and then you hear a new guy there, and then the new guy's got an assistant and stuff like that. I think every one of those is chipping away at Joe, and they Joe stayed on probably long enough to secure himself. He's in a good position to make good money there. Especially, I don't see him as a huge lifestyle guy. Like, he wasn't about like partying after the UFCs or anything like that ever. He was very serious. So hopefully he socked away some money, and now he's living a good life. He deserves it, because I think, like I said, he was one of the first people that Dana had to clash with, and Dana couldn't just get rid of. Maybe the only one who lasted that long as well. Now Dana's surrounded by hunters, buddy, and this, that, and it's a buddy club. Joe Silva was not a part of that. I think there was some testimony that was making the rounds in terms of something he gave in. Joe appeared in the the salary lawsuit the UFC's involved in, and you can tell in that discussion how Dana and the Fertittas limited him, and that he wasn't the true maker there. There were times there that he has to deliver a message, like, okay, you're cut, you're walked and stuff. That wasn't his message. He's giving the boss's message out. And you got to do that sometimes. That's what mid management is, because he does have to do what the bosses say, oddly enough. But there, you know, you do get into feelings and touchiness inside, and Joe really, had his guys, had ways and guys that he might want to give chances to, and then other guys he didn't like. He was very much of that. And him and Dana clashed in there, but I think they kept him at, like, yeah, you play around with the undercards. Yeah, he needs 20,000 for this next fight. Yeah, sure, give it to him. What does Chuck need? Liddell, okay, now you're talking. They separated him. They let him play that he didn't even have to ask for money. They never challenged him because he understood that when the UFC paid less than 2-2 for fighters, he was there in the management teams that did that. Peretti, etc. Those were down days. So to jump somebody up a huge amount wasn't in his nature. So he managed the under budget well enough that he never had to ask for money. So he never had to be turned down. And this was a good arrangement. But it really does seem like they cut him off at some point.
How much you think? Well, let me ask you this. There's been, I don't know if you looked at the Twitter, like they handle Joe Silva stories. There are a lot of those making the rounds amongst fighters. Maybe I should have had you look at that before we did this, but it seemed like he kind of had a bad reputation as far as like he wasn't all that nice to some of them, I would say.
Yeah, I think he started to reflect Dana a little bit. That you have to kind of come across as like, yeah, I can just replace you. I don't need you. That was, I think, the overwhelming attitude. I think Joe had a few things against him, in that I think that, like I said, you got to give bad news. If you're not prepared to give that bad news, then how you give it becomes, maybe hurt a little bit. So maybe he was brash, or, and the other part is that physically he's a small guy. And now you're talking about fighters and stuff like that. And I can't tell you how many dozens, and I'm talking about dozens of fighters, have mentioned that little, so and so, or I would kill him, I could smash him with one finger, So being small and, yelling, you suck at, guys that are very good and stuff like that. There's an art to doing it. And sometimes maybe he didn't handle that as well as possible. He also had fighters that will say that he was firmly on their side and helped them, got them fights, and helped them out in a myriad of different ways as well. So, I don't hold that against him. I think that in many of those occasions, it's probably him having to give a message that Dana says, all right, I listened to you. You disagree. Now go do what I say anyway. And I think that sums up what I would. It's an educated guess, but it's a guess on what that relationship was like. But I think it's very much like that.
Now, I remember you mentioned something about Jeff Osborne, wasn't he? I don't know if he were kind of their stories intersect. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, no. This is an interesting story because the way this works is if you look at the history of the UFC, I believe Jeff Osborne did 7 or 8 UFC pay-per-views or 7 or 8 UFC shows on mic in Joe Rogan's job, doing Joe Rogan's job before Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan replaced him. Joe Rogan replaced him mainly because I believe that Lorenzo didn't like Jeff. And I think it really just comes down to didn't like his delivery style, and that sort of stuff. So even though he has a lot of credo and a lot of respect in the business, that is the stuff that the Fertitas didn't really give a shit about. So but the reason he had that job is because he was a friend of Joe's. That Joe got him in. Joe got him at least the interview, the chance. Here's a guy that the hook and shoot tapes. You listen back to him and you listen to what he's commentating on the fights. He's doing an excellent job. But that's literally him in his basement in the old days, but still in his basement with editing equipment, editing it, and literally in his basement saying, yeah, I can barely hear myself above the crowd, because he's dubbing in things later and was doing things.
Yeah.
But a guy that does things like that homemade to get an interview for that job, I believe Joe Silva facilitated that. said he's good. I vouch for the fact that his information that he gives about the fights is spot on most of the time, and he was there for 7 or 8 shows. Now, Fertitta didn't like him, but this is the going away of a Joe person and now another California person who would eventually become a multimillionaire many times over. It looks like, Joe wasn't in that clique. And that's, I think, what it looks like. Osborne is the main example because he had a visible job for the UFC. He's the main example of a guy that, at the end of the day, I think the Fertittas and Dana now, if they even remembered that, they would still say that, that was small time stuff, and then what they had in mind was so much bigger. We launched Rogan into Hollywood stardom and stuff like that, and that's how they do. That's how they roll, and Jeff doesn't roll that way. At the end of the day, I think they still think they made the right move, right? But if we're looking at Joe Silva's history, that was a key example of Joe people getting moved away from the show. That also happened with friends like that Joe might have had and supporters like Joe Gold, or like people on Press Row that counted on him to get them a UFC pass in the old days. And he maybe had, Joe definitely had a network of people that talked to him. Hey, you went to that King of the Cage? How'd that guy look? This, that, and the other stuff. There was no dummy. He wanted to be a matchmaker, and he was working on that. The key to me in that job is seeing fights. And that's what he did with the tape trading and then that network of people. But cutting him off from that, at the end of the day, the UFC matchmaker doesn't need to do anything but go to the mail and get his tapes, or go to his email now and get the video that they attached. And there's your tryout. You don't need to hit the road to see fighters or know a guy who's going to go to a show to see if you can get, somebody who's been interesting and stuff. But that's where Joe comes from. So, Osborne would have been the biggest, but there was a cutting off of old guard people and bringing in of new people that left Joe a lot weaker.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Gold, Ryan Bennett, there are several of them.
Yeah. Eddie Goldman was another very violent one. He was a Peretti person, but here's a longtime guy that's been reporting on the sport. And yeah, he's got his website, and that's how he does it. Most people in those days went to guys like that for news on this sport, but they cut him out, brought in an ESPN guy. He didn't know anything, but he took pictures, put it on, the progression's there. But there were a lot, that moving of the old guard, like I said, that weakened Joe, because that network of people were people that rooted for Joe. People wanted Joe to be the UFC matchmaker especially after Peretti left. I mean, what else could they do?
Now, how much do you think he walked away from with the sale? You think he just never have to work again, and that's why he disappeared?
I would think that I would give him credit for managing his money well. Like I said, I don't think he was a lifestyle guy. It wasn't him, partying in Cancun on New Year's ever. You know what I mean? And so I think so. I think he had access in a position where he should have enough money, hopefully, to live the rest of his life. And he deserves that in my book. I don't begrudge anything. He had a really tough position. I think he walked away trying to do it as ethically as possible. But I think that, yes, some of it, wasn't his style. And if you're not running this like a sport and you're running it more of like a spectacle, you might butt heads with him because he was a purist that way. And at that point, you're butting heads with the boss all the time. The boss wants you gone. The boss brought in another matchmaker. All of a sudden, now there's 2 of you, and you got to go to meetings and stuff. That the progression of getting rid of Joe, it took him a while. So there was a point in the early days of Zuffa where he had gone from the East Coast and gotten an apartment in Vegas. So he's already transitioned, and the decision was made to keep that sort of stuff. And there was a period where, because of a falling out, he went back to the East Coast and left Vegas for a while. And at some point, some type of reconciliation was made. And, if that meant stock or, some percentage or, something like that, he should be comfortable. Keep in mind, I would consider that also within the realm of, like the fighters, You're talking about the guy who was your management for 10 years and was your only guy who actually knew a network in the fighters and the sport. And, okay, this guy's in Japan. I could reach here and reach him and this. That stuff comes with experience and time. That guy was Joe, so they needed him. So at some point, I'm sure they took care of him. But just like the fighters, I'm sure he was actually probably underpaid. Just like the old you hear the Sherdog story where Jeff Sherwood, after ages of dedicating his life to the website, sold it for $1 million. And everybody's like, $1 million? But now in retrospect, it really was worth it. He had done so much groundwork, and it was still a respected site now because of that groundwork from the old days. In my estimation, probably it was worth a lot more than $1 million. I bet Jeff at times thinks that these days as well. So yeah, I think that there's the guys that became generational monies, Rogan, Dana, they're on that other side of the line. And Joe Silva is on this side of the line, including the fight.
I find ironic that they replaced him with Sean Shelby, who kind of came from the same background. He was around in the old days. He was a guy who had website, MMA Ring Report,
Look, by the time Shelby came on, Dana was already a media personality. Whenever that was, because Dana did that quick. And Dana got rid of Joe, like Joe doesn't do. At some point, you can see a very finite moment where he never did another interview again. So he became an office worker. And Dana became the personality. And now you've got years of that. And then after a while, they're doing another weight class, 5 years till 2008 or whatever, when they absorbed WEC. Whatever the exact history is, it was a few years. And then Sean Shelby comes on. And Dana at that point either is going to give the job to somebody who knows how to do it, or he's going to do it himself. And doing it himself, like I said, there's a clerical aspect to the job where, you're sitting there, talking to a lawyer, trying to get the lawyer to change language on a contract for a specific person. Maybe it doesn't really happen in the UFC, but you get the idea back and forth. Did you get that signed? Is that signature clear? Especially back in the old days, all that clerical work, he doesn't want to do that. That's what he has Joe for. So I'm not surprised he hired somebody who was competent and in the business at that point.
Now, what do you think the agreement was contractually? Like, do you think we'll ever see him resurface to talk about anything?
When I left Bodog, there was part of an agreement in the original contract was that I wouldn't give details out about certain aspects of the business, especially things I might have heard about the gambling business or whatever. So I would augment that for Joe as he left. Art Davey talks about how when he left Zuffa, there was already in his contract, there was a non-compete clause that had expired, so he actually could go out and do another show. But yeah, these things are always handled by contract after a certain level. So it's not surprising to me that Joe, so after 10 or 12 years, he's going to leave. They're going to give him, look, here's your stock options. You can cash that out. There's 1.6 million for you. Walk away, never talk about us again. Hey, I'm completely making up numbers there, but it's something like that. And at that point, you put your life into that, you're going to walk away anyway. It's not really in a position where it's like, all right, you want to keep doing that job. I'm sure it was exhausting. You're going to take the money and you walk away. You walk away with some dignity, not all of your dignity. I think that would best describe Joe. I don't think he's the happiest with, I think him painted as a bad guy at this point in the history of this sport is really misclassifying him. Like, I know the fighters can complain about him for whatever X reasons and stuff like that. But to be honest with you, like I said, a lot of that I think was forced on his personality because he was asked, handling it. He was handling it at a different, higher level, you know. And Dana is the guy who was like, yeah, I don't give a shit. Cut Tito, huh? It's like those are go call Tito and tell him he's fired. I don't even want to talk to him anymore. And Joe would have to do that. I don't know, if that particular scenario, like I say, I'm just example, but over the years, I think that the way fighters talk about him when he wasn't on their side, it sounds a little bit like he's assuming the personality of the company and the boss more than doing it his way and being. I think he was a little bit more of a communicator than they allowed him to be, and I think that kind of stings a little bit. So here's your walk away package, 1.6 million. Yeah, by the way, Dana just blew that on his kid's, high school graduation party. So there's levels to the game, and so Joe, like I say, is clearly on this side of the fence, underpaid, even along with the fighters and stuff like that. And a guy I think who's going to, at the end of the day, probably go down misunderstood, especially if he doesn't resurface and tell his side of the story.
Yeah. It's interesting topic for sure. And I appreciate you taking the time to kind of share your relationship with Joe, as from back in the day. And before we go, I want you to kind of talk about what you're doing on your stuff with the MMA Museum and the podcast, maybe some of the shows you've done lately.
Well, the collector stuff we keep putting out. I think the episodes come out every 5 days. So, every 5 days you get hit with a new piece of memorabilia. We had, Mark Hall's pants from UFC 7, and we looked at some of the old poker chips that the UFC had put out, and we looked at a Pride trophy. And so we do the whole gamut of try to touch on history with the MMA collector stuff and, look at that stuff. And then on the MMA Museum podcast, I just interviewed Jennifer Howe, a real woman's pioneer, and Dave Strasser, an old friend of mine, is one of the recent podcasts, or one, I think that one comes out next week. So just having fun doing it, just getting people's stories, on the record kind of thing. And that's what the MMA Museum is all about. Hopefully at the end of the day, the roll call there would be a long list of people that are interesting. Everybody's got an interesting story. Let's just bring it out.
Yeah, I was at Strasser's fight with Ronald John in Super Brawl. I don't remember which one it was, but a long time ago.
Did he lose that fight?
He did. Yeah.
Yeah. That's okay. That's okay. Dave has a pretty good. He's moved on. He's a school teacher now.
Yeah.
Teaching. He's like he's teaching math to like ninth graders. It's like who'd have thought? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's moved on with his life, but when he talks back on his career, I think he's pretty grounded and not bitter. And I think that's one of the things I look for is guys that, it's all right if guys get like shed a tear and be like, man, I didn't make, I could have done better and stuff like that. But no, I'm talking about guys, a different level of bitter, like you find in boxing kind of bitter,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm glad that we avoid those on certain occasions. You're worried about it. Maybe this guy's going to be bitter, and hasn't been the case yet. So I'm happy.
Yeah. Well, as always, I appreciate taking the time to shed some more light. I think there's a lot of episodes that we could do like this because there's all kinds of stuff from back in the day that, a lot of people that had a lot of impact, but that people don't necessarily know about. Not just fighters, but certain things. And
Yeah, I don't. I think unless someone like Joe Gold, like if Joe Gold, Eddie Goldman, Joe, if they gave an opinion of from back in those days that's a little different than mine, I respect that because they may have seen Joe a different way or had a relationship with him that was a little different. But I don't think you can find too many people who go back that far, and that's Joe's true history. Like when Joe was an assistant to Art Davie, Joe told me this story, and I confirmed it with Art Davie many, many years later. But Art Davie, after Don Fry won, I think it was the Ultimate, the second one. Art Davie said, "Oh yeah, by the way, Joe, you're gonna have to go back." And Don is, a handful at all times. Approach Don and give him bad news at your own risk. You know what I mean? And Art Davie made Joe go and be like, "Hey, I got to take the belt back from you. It's not your belt to keep." And Art did that to him as a joke, kind of breaking in the new kid and stuff like that. So, but that's, you can research, that was 97, that was a long time ago that he was around. And, believe it or not, that little story there, that's cutting your teeth to do that job, So he had the right background. He was, how people remember him, it's okay. But when he was that green guy being bossed around by Art Davie, the sport really had a friend. And at some point, you know, he became more of a business person with the UFC. I think he had to more than anything else. And that's my story. That's my remembrance of Joe Silva. A fond remembrance. I liked him.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the time and to shed your kind of knowledge on the topic. And for anybody that supports these episodes, as always, I appreciate it. And until the next one, take care.
Yeah, but